Episode 24, titled OSINT Breaches and Credential Exposure, we're going to focus on how credential exposure changes risk even before you touch a single system. Pen Test Plus scenarios often test whether you can reason about likelihood and priority based on identity risk signals, and breach exposure is one of the clearest signals an organization can have. The key is that you can understand increased risk without performing unsafe actions, because the exam is measuring judgment, not opportunism. Credential exposure shifts the probability side of risk, especially when accounts are reused, portals are exposed, or legacy authentication paths remain available. This topic also requires strong ethical discipline, because the difference between risk assessment and unauthorized access attempt can be a single bad decision. By the end of this episode, you should be able to describe what breach data is, why reuse matters, how common attack patterns work conceptually, and how to communicate risk responsibly without misusing sensitive information. Breach data can include several types of identity-related information, and understanding these types helps you reason about risk and remediation without turning the topic into a scavenger hunt. Email addresses can reveal which identities may be affected and can help you infer exposure scale, especially when the organization uses consistent naming patterns. Passwords, when exposed, are obvious risk because they can enable direct access, but they also create secondary risk, because people often reuse patterns even when they do not reuse exact strings. Hashes are different because they represent passwords in an encoded form, and the presence of hashes can still indicate exposure even when you do not handle them directly. Associated metadata can include timestamps, service names, and context about where the leak occurred, which influences how current or relevant the exposure may be. The exam does not require you to analyze breach dumps, but it does require you to understand that these data types exist and that their presence changes likelihood reasoning. Treat breach data as a risk indicator that must be handled carefully, not as a toolbox to exploit.
Reused risk is the central concept because one leak can unlock many accounts through repetition, and this is where the probability of compromise increases sharply.
Many users reuse the same password across multiple services or reuse predictable variations, especially when they manage many accounts and have limited support for password management habits.
Even when exact reuse is uncommon, pattern reuse is common, such as using the same base word with small changes, which still increases attacker success rates. This means that a leak in one place can become a key that fits other locks, including business portals and third-party services, even if those services were never breached themselves. On Pen Test Plus, reuse risk often shows up as a scenario queue that increases likelihood, making identity-focused mitigations more urgent than purely technical patching in some contexts.
The professional point is that reuse turns external exposure into internal risk without requiring any vulnerability in the internal systems.
When you can articulate reuse risk clearly, you can justify why certain controls are prioritized.
Credential stuffing can be explained conceptually as trying known credentials across many services, using the fact that reused credentials often work somewhere. The attacker is not guessing a password in the traditional sense. They are testing whether already known pairs match other login surfaces. This is important because it changes the defense posture, as rate limits and lockouts alone may not be sufficient if attackers distribute attempts or target many services. It also changes the risk story because credential stuffing is often low skill and high scale, meaning the likelihood can be high when exposed portals exist. In exam scenarios, credential stuffing is often hinted at by mention of widespread login attempts across many accounts, particularly on internet-facing portals. The best exam answers tend to reflect that the root cause is reuse and exposure, and that mitigations should focus on stronger authentication and monitoring rather than only on password complexity slogans. When you can describe credential stuffing in plain terms, you can select the right defensive priorities without overcomplicating the concept. Password spraying is conceptually different, and a clean way to understand it is as making a small number of guesses across many accounts rather than many guesses against one account. The goal is to avoid lockouts by staying under thresholds while still finding weak passwords that are common or predictable. In practical terms, this attack pattern targets the reality that some accounts will have weak choices, and the attacker is trying to find those accounts without generating obvious one account under brute force alerts. On Pen Test Plus questions, spraying is often implied by low-volume attempts spread across many accounts, sometimes combined with time spacing or distributed sources. The defense implications point toward monitoring, detection, and strong authentication practices rather than relying solely on lockout triggers. Spraying also intersects with user education and password policy enforcement, because weak password prevalence increases attacker success rates. Understanding spraying helps you interpret scenario cues about authentication attempts and choose recommendations that match the behavior.
Certain signals increase likelihood when credential exposure exists, and the exam will often embed these signals to guide prioritization.
Exposed portals increase likelihood because they provide accessible login surfaces that can be targeted at scale. Weak multi-factor authentication, or the absence of strong second factors, increases likelihood because stolen credentials can be sufficient for access without additional barriers. Legacy logins increase likelihood because older systems often have weaker controls, inconsistent monitoring, or less reliable enforcement of modern authentication policies. These signals matter because they transform exposure from concerning to urgent, especially when the organization's most critical systems rely on those access pathways. On exam questions, likelihood cues are often small phrases about exposed services, inconsistent enforcement, or older systems, and you should treat them as the reason certain mitigations rise to the top. A professional risk statement combines exposure signals with control strength to explain probability clearly. When you pay attention to these signals, you prioritize realistically rather than emotionally.
Ethical boundaries are critical here because breach-related information can tempt people to test credentials directly, and that quickly crosses into unauthorized behavior if it is not explicitly permitted. Avoid unauthorized login attempts or unsafe handling because "I was just checking" is not a defense in professional contexts. Even within an authorized engagement, credential testing must be clearly allowed by scope and rules of engagement, and it must be performed in a controlled way that minimizes disruption and avoids triggering account lockouts or operational incidents. Unsafe handling includes copying or distributing exposed credential material, storing it insecurely, or sharing it with audiences that do not need it to remediate. The exam often rewards answers that focus on risk assessment and controlled communication rather than opportunistic testing of leaked credentials. Ethical discipline also protects the organization because mishandling breach data can become a secondary breach. When you treat the data as toxic, you keep the work defensible and safe. Validating risk safely means confirming exposure patterns and control gaps without misusing the data, and this is a subtle but important exam concept. Safe validation can include confirming that an organization's identity surfaces are exposed and that the controls around them are strong, such as whether multi-factor authentication is enforced consistently and whether monitoring is capable of detecting abnormal login patterns. It can also include confirming that the naming patterns and account lifecycle practices are consistent, because weak governance increases the chance that exposed identities remain active. The key is that safe validation focuses on the environment and control posture, not on proving access using leaked credentials. On the exam, the best next step in a breach exposure scenario is often to assess control strength and recommend immediate protective actions rather than attempting logins. This approach reduces harm and still enables the organization to take meaningful risk reduction steps. When you can describe safe validation, you demonstrate professional judgment.
Reporting language should describe potential impact and recommended controls clearly, without exaggerating or implying that compromise has already occurred, unless the scenario states that it has.
A strong report statement distinguishes exposure from exploitation, explaining that exposed credential material increases likelihood and can enable unauthorized access if reused credentials are present.
It also frames potential impact in terms of what systems those accounts could reach, especially if identity governance is broad, or if the organization relies on single sign-on pathways that concentrate access. Recommended controls should be stated in actionable terms, emphasizing improvements that reduce likelihood quickly, such as strengthening authentication requirements and improving detection and response readiness. Reporting should also be careful not to include sensitive credential material itself, because the report is often distributed widely and can become an exposure channel. On Pen Test Plus questions, the best communication answers usually balance urgency with precision, making it clear why the risk is elevated without turning probability into certainty.
When reporting is disciplined, the organization can act without panic. Now consider a scenario where leaked credentials match an employee naming pattern, because this is a common exam-style setup that tests inference without overreach. The prompt suggests that exposed identities appear consistent with the organization's email format, which increases confidence that the exposure is relevant rather than random. That match raises questions about reuse risk and about whether those identities still exist, but it does not prove that the passwords still work or that accounts are currently compromised. The professional next step is to treat this as a high likelihood risk indicator and to move toward protective actions and control validation, not toward unauthorized login attempts. You would also document the reasoning clearly. The naming pattern match suggests relevance, which elevates likelihood, and therefore mitigations should be prioritized. The exam often offers an option to test a few logins to confirm, and the correct answer is frequently to avoid that unless explicit permission and safe procedures are established. This scenario is designed to test whether you can be urgent without becoming reckless. Recommended mitigations often cluster around a few high-impact actions: strong multi-factor authentication, password resets for effective accounts, monitoring improvements, and user education that reduces recurrence. Multi-factor authentication reduces the usefulness of stolen credentials by adding a barrier that attackers cannot obtain from a breach alone, especially when enforced consistently across exposed portals and legacy paths. Resets and rotation reduce risk by invalidating potentially reused passwords, but they should be applied thoughtfully to avoid operational disruption while still reducing exposure. Monitoring helps detect abnormal access patterns, enabling fast response if credential stuffing or spraying behaviors occur, and it supports investigation if compromise is suspected. User education matters because it reduces reuse and improves reporting of suspicious activity, especially when paired with clear organizational guidance. The exam tends to reward mitigations that are both immediate and preventive because that demonstrates mature risk management. When you can connect mitigations directly to the exposure and reuse problem, your recommendations fit the scenario. A major pitfall is assuming breach data is current or accurate, because breach datasets can be old, incomplete, or misattributed. Accounts may have been deprovisioned, passwords may have been changed,
and the organization's controls may have improved since the exposure occurred. Another pitfall is assuming that the presence of an email implies that the account exists in the organization's identity system today, because naming patterns can be imitated or reused across multiple contexts.
Overconfidence leads to overclaiming, such as asserting that compromise has occurred when the scenario only indicates exposure risk.
There is also the pitfall of treating breach exposure as purely an identity problem when it may reveal broader governance weaknesses, such as poor access lifecycle management or inconsistent multi-factor enforcement. The professional approach acknowledges uncertainty and focuses on controls that reduce risk regardless of whether a specific leaked password still works.
On exam questions, answers that demonstrate cautious precision tend to be more correct than answers that turn exposure into certainty.
A simple memory anchor can keep your reasoning structured, and a useful one is exposure, reuse, likelihood, controls, report. Exposure reminds you that breach data indicates a risk condition that exists outside your systems but influences them. Reuse reminds you that repetition is the bridge that turns external exposure into internal access risk. Likelihood reminds you to evaluate feasibility based on exposed portals, multi-factor strength, monitoring, and legacy logins in the scenario.
Controls reminds you to prioritize practical mitigations that reduce probability quickly and prevent recurrence.
Report reminds you to communicate clearly and safely, separating exposure from confirmed compromise and avoiding sensitive data leakage in your own documentation.
This anchor maps cleanly to how Pentest Plus frames identity risk questions because it keeps you focused on defensible reasoning.
If you can run the anchor, you can choose actions that reduce harm while improving security posture.
In this episode, the main lesson is that credential exposure changes risk by increasing likelihood, often dramatically, without requiring any direct attack on internal systems. Breach data types can include emails, passwords, hashes, and metadata, and reuse risk is the mechanism that can turn one leak into many account compromises. Credential stuffing and password spraying are conceptual patterns that exploit reuse and weak passwords at scale, especially when exposed portals, weak multi-factor, or legacy logins exist. Ethical boundaries require you to avoid unauthorized login attempts and unsafe handling, focusing instead on safe validation of control posture and rapid protective actions. Report with precision. Recommend controls that reduce likelihood quickly, and avoid pitfalls like assuming breach data is current or accurate. Now classify one mitigation priority by choosing which control would reduce likelihood fastest in a typical exposed portal scenario, because that decision logic is what the exam is trying to measure. When you can do that calmly, you turn breach exposure from panic into structured risk management. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.